Most people believe that if they could receive the right advice, their lives would finally begin to change. They search for books, podcasts, mentors, and motivational videos, hoping that somewhere there is a sentence capable of removing their uncertainty. Whenever they feel stuck, their first instinct is often to ask, "What should I do?" It sounds like a sensible question, yet it may not be the most important one. In many cases, people already know what they should do. What they are really asking is, how can I stop being afraid of doing it? That distinction matters more than it first appears. Imagine someone who has spent years in a job that leaves them emotionally exhausted. Every morning, they wake up with little enthusiasm, count the hours until the day ends, and quietly wonder whether this is all life has to offer. Deep inside, they already know that something has to change. They may need to apply for a different position, learn a new skill, or even change careers completely. None of these possibilities has escaped their attention. In fact, they have probably imagined them countless times. Yet months turn into years, and nothing happens. From the outside, it seems as though they need better advice. From the inside, however, the problem is completely different. They are not struggling with a lack of direction. They are struggling with the emotional cost of taking the first step. This pattern appears in almost every area of life. People know they should have an honest conversation instead of avoiding conflict. They know they should exercise more regularly instead of waiting for the perfect Monday to begin. They know they should stop comparing themselves with strangers on social media. The knowledge is already there. What keeps them motionless is not confusion but hesitation. For this reason, modern life presents us with an unusual paradox. Never before has information been so widely available, yet uncertainty seems to affect more people than ever. Within seconds, we can find advice on relationships, careers, mental health, productivity, or personal finance. Every problem appears to have thousands of experts offering solutions. At first glance, this should make decision-making easier. Strangely, it often has the opposite effect. The more advice we consume, the more we begin to believe that somewhere there must be a perfect answer. We become reluctant to act because we fear choosing the wrong path. Instead of reducing uncertainty, unlimited information sometimes increases it. Every new opinion introduces another possibility, another warning, another reason to delay action. Eventually, we become trapped in endless preparation, convincing ourselves that one more article or one more video will finally eliminate every doubt. The difficulty is that uncertainty cannot be eliminated completely. Life has never offered absolute certainty, and it probably never will. Every meaningful decision involves a degree of risk because the future refuses to reveal itself in advance. No mentor, no matter how experienced, can guarantee that your business will succeed, your relationship will last, or your dream will unfold exactly as you imagine. Advice can improve your judgment, but it cannot remove uncertainty itself. This is precisely where courage becomes more valuable than knowledge. Courage is often misunderstood as a personality trait that some people naturally possess, while others do not. We admire confident individuals and assume they experience less fear than the rest of us. However, psychological research and everyday experience suggests something quite different. Fear is remarkably democratic. It visits entrepreneurs before they launch companies, musicians before they perform, athletes before important competitions, and ordinary people before difficult conversations. The difference is rarely the presence or absence of fear. It is the decision that follows it. Unfortunately, fear is rarely obvious. It does not usually announce itself by saying, "You are frightened." Instead, it disguises itself as rational thinking. It tells you that you should wait until you have more experience. It insists that the timing is not ideal. It encourages you to collect additional information before making a commitment. Because these thoughts sound responsible rather than emotional, we often mistake avoidance for wisdom. This is one of the most convincing tricks our minds can play. Preparation certainly has value. Learning before acting is often sensible. The problem begins when preparation quietly becomes a substitute for action. At that point, learning no longer serves growth, it serves comfort. We continue collecting information not because we genuinely need it, but because every new piece of advice postpones the uncomfortable moment when we must finally take responsibility for our own decisions. There is a subtle sense of safety in remaining a learner. As long as you are still preparing, nobody can judge your performance. You cannot fail at a business that never begins. You cannot be rejected if you never express your feelings. You cannot disappoint yourself if you never truly try. Remaining in the planning stage protects your confidence in the short term, but it often damages your future in ways that are much more difficult to recognize. Years later, many people discover that their greatest obstacle was never a lack of ability. It was an attachment to emotional safety. The irony is that confidence, the quality people believe they must possess before acting, is usually created by action itself. Very few individuals begin a new challenge feeling completely prepared. Most confident people simply have more experience surviving situations that once frightened them. Each difficult conversation, each failed attempt, and each uncertain decision becomes evidence that discomfort is temporary rather than permanent. Confidence, therefore, is less a prerequisite for courage than a consequence of it. Once we recognize this, an uncomfortable truth begins to emerge. Perhaps the question is no longer, "What advice am I missing?" Perhaps the better question is, "Am I using the search for advice to avoid a decision I already know I need to make?" That question is far more difficult to answer because it shifts the responsibility away from the world and back to ourselves. It forces us to admit that the next step in our lives may not depend on discovering another brilliant idea. It may depend on finding the courage to act on the wisdom we already possess. Of course, recognizing this truth does not suddenly make courage easier. If it did, everyone who understood the importance of bravery would immediately begin living without hesitation. The challenge lies in the fact that courage asks us to move before certainty arrives. It requires us to accept that reassurance will always be incomplete. For many people, this is deeply uncomfortable because the human mind naturally prefers predictability. We are drawn toward situations where the outcome feels familiar, even if that familiarity leaves us dissatisfied. This explains why people sometimes remain in circumstances they openly admit are making them unhappy. The known discomfort feels less frightening than the unknown possibility of change. A disappointing job, an unhealthy relationship, or an unfulfilled dream may gradually become part of everyday life. Over time, the pain becomes familiar enough to tolerate, while the uncertainty of something better continues to feel intimidating. Psychologists often describe this tendency as a preference for certainty over possibility. Although possibility may offer greater happiness, Certainty provides immediate emotional security. As a result, people frequently choose what is predictable rather than what is meaningful. Ironically, this decision creates a different kind of risk, one that is far less visible. When we avoid difficult choices, life does not remain still. Opportunities disappear, circumstances change, and time quietly continues its journey. The cost of inaction is rarely paid immediately, which is why it is so easy to underestimate. Unlike failure, which announces itself clearly, regret often develops gradually. It begins as a quiet thought that returns from time to time. I wonder what would have happened if I had tried. For many people, that question becomes heavier with age. This does not mean that courageous decisions always lead to success. Sometimes they lead to disappointment. Sometimes they reveal that our expectations were unrealistic. Sometimes they force us to begin again. Yet, even these outcomes contain something valuable. They replace uncertainty with understanding. Instead of imagining countless possibilities, we finally encounter reality, and reality, although imperfect, is usually easier to work with than endless speculation. Fear thrives in imagination. It exaggerates consequences, predicts embarrassment, and convinces us that one mistake will permanently define our future. Reality is rarely so dramatic. People recover from failed interviews. Businesses close and new ones begin. Relationships end and unexpected connections appear. Careers change direction. Human beings possess a remarkable ability to adapt, but we often forget this because fear focuses our attention on what might be lost rather than on what can still be built. This is why courage should not be understood as blind optimism. Courage is not the belief that everything will work out perfectly. Instead, it is the confidence that whatever happens, we will find a way to respond. The courageous person does not expect an easy journey. They simply refuse to let uncertainty become the final decision maker. There is another misunderstanding that deserves attention. People often assume that courage is demonstrated only through dramatic actions, quitting a job overnight, moving to another country, or making a life-changing announcement. In reality, the strongest form of courage is frequently much quieter. Sometimes courage is admitting that you are wrong. Sometimes it is asking for help after pretending to be strong for too long. Sometimes it is saying no to expectations that no longer reflect the person you are becoming. Sometimes it is choosing consistency over excitement, returning to a difficult task day after day, even when no one is watching your progress. These moments rarely attract public admiration, yet they shape our character far more than a single extraordinary event. Character, after all, is built through repeated choices rather than isolated moments. Every time we choose honesty instead of convenience, responsibility instead of excuses, or growth instead of comfort, we strengthen a habit that gradually transforms the way we see ourselves. Confidence then becomes less dependent on external praise because it is supported by evidence. We know we can trust ourselves, not because life has become easier, but because we have repeatedly proven that we can face difficulty without immediately retreating. Perhaps this is what genuine self-confidence really means. It is not believing that you will never fail. It is believing that failure will not prevent you from continuing. Once this perspective begins to develop, advice also starts to occupy its proper place. Advice becomes a guide rather than a substitute for action. We still learn from experienced people, seek constructive feedback, and remain open to new ideas. However, we stop expecting advice to remove every fear before we begin. We understand that no sentence, however inspiring, can replace the personal experience of acting despite uncertainty. Knowledge expands the mind. Courage expands the life. Without knowledge, we may act carelessly. Without courage, we may never act at all. The balance between the two is what allows meaningful progress to happen. Yet if one of them must come first at the decisive moment, it is almost always courage. There comes a point when additional information produces diminishing returns, while a single brave decision creates possibilities that no amount of planning could ever reveal. Perhaps that is why some of the most significant turning points in life appear surprisingly ordinary when they happen. They begin with a conversation that almost did not take place, an application that was nearly left unfinished, a phone call that was postponed for weeks, a dream that survived one final excuse. Looking back, people often describe these moments as life-changing. Looking forward, however, they rarely felt heroic. They simply felt frightening. That may be the most reassuring truth of all. If you are waiting to feel completely fearless before taking action, you may wait forever. Fear is not necessarily a sign that you are moving in the wrong direction. Quite often, it is evidence that you are approaching something that genuinely matters. The presence of fear does not automatically mean you should stop. Sometimes it means you are standing at the edge of meaningful growth. So the next time you find yourself searching for another book, another expert, or another piece of reassurance, pause for a moment and ask an uncomfortable but honest question. Do I truly need more advice, or am I simply hoping that someone else will remove the responsibility of choosing? The answer may change the way you approach every important decision from this point forward. Because the distance between an ordinary life and an extraordinary one is not always measured by intelligence, talent, or even opportunity. More often, it is measured by the willingness to take one uncertain step before the outcome is guaranteed. Advice can illuminate the road ahead, but only courage can persuade you to begin walking.